Hello and welcome everyone. We're delighted that you're joining us today to discuss globes, travel and literary networks at the Inns of Court and today. Emily, Stevenson and I are postdocs on the TIDE project at the University of Oxford, and we're joined today by the artist and globe maker Loraine Rutt. Loraine is a London-based artist and cartographer who has been making maps from clay for over 30 years. Her show at Central St. Martin's in 1990 was a cartographically inspired galleon, complete with figurehead. This show launched her career with bowls, hand basins, and tile panels. And in fact, I believe the first piece she sold was a globe. Travel and maps remain her primary influence. She's traveled through Spain, through the US by motorbike, and Mexico, collecting images and stories. Her one-off pieces have varied in scale, from large architectural ceramics to miniature porcelains. More recently, Loraine has been creating a series of relief landscapes, emphasizing river and coastline erosion. Her little globe company has grown from an idea to recreate historical pocket globes for modern collectors. And we'll be looking at some of these really spectacular globes a bit later on, these miniature worlds that can be held in one hand. So we've been very fortunate to come together to collaborate on a 4-month exhibition at the Middle Temple Library in London, which is due to open this September, which I've realized to some dismay is next month. So the exhibition we have titled From Middle Temple to Manoa, which explores the fascination for travel and expansion demonstrated by members of the Inns of Court in the 16th and 17th centuries. And Manoa is a reference to what the Spanish and what the English often called El Dorado. So this kind of mythical city of gold, but Manoa is the indigenous Arawak name for that space. From the wooden panels of private libraries to those of ships carrying them to different parts of the world, Elizabethan and Jacobean gentlemen regularly engaged in imaginary and actual travel, fueled by the growing availability of travel literature, trade reports, and colonial letters. The demand for commodities and knowledge about the world quickly became part of the literary and social media of the Inns. So our exhibition places the Inns within these global contexts to consider the geopolitics of expansion and its relationship to elite notions of civil refinement. So I think I speak for Emily and myself when I say that it's been really eye-opening and marvelous to work with Loraine and to hold conversations about the archives and the early modern fascination with the world alongside Loraine's technical expertise and brilliant craftsmanship. So to open the session today, Emily and I are going to kick off by setting the scene with a brief introduction to the Inns of Court for those who might not know too much about them, and then speak briefly about some of the ideas underpinning the exhibition and to share some of the sources that will be on display. And we'll then turn to Loraine's work and the way that she's engaged creatively with this material as we've moved forward. So the aim is really to have a conversation about this collaborative process and about how we see art and the archives working together. So I'll just share my screen now so that we can share some of the fantastic images that we have for you today. And so for those who don't know, the 4 Inns of Court are the professional associations for barristers dating from the Middle Ages and still in operation today. There are 4, Gray's Inn, Inner Temple, Middle Temple, and Lincoln's Inn, and they're nestled in the heart of the city of London. So the Middle Temple is just opposite the Royal Courts of Justice and a very short walk to the banks of the Thames. And they're also very near the kind of throbbing vein of the Strand and all the kind of aristocratic houses and taverns and marketplaces in that area. In addition to spaces of learning, where young men from across England and Wales came to receive education in the practice of the law, the Inns were really important social and cultural spaces. In the Tudor and Stuart eras, gentlemen were encouraged to think about the law and government through creative refraction. So there are these really amazing spaces where we can think about entertainments, spectacles, literary outputs, which were all a mandatory feature of the formal education that Inn's gentlemen received. They were, as the scholar Jessica Winston wrote, places of play, where gentlemen debated politics and placed themselves within the important political debates of the time through sometimes quite saucy and subversive performances. They're also the place where Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors was performed at Gray's Inn in 1594 and Twelfth Night at Middle Temple in 1602. And something that I'm really interested in my work is the sociability at the inn. So the kind of the feasting, the revels, the poetry writing that comes out of this space. And at the Middle Temple, gentlemen dined together in this hall, and also frequently met at the pubs and taverns in the nearby Strand. Looking back at his time at the Middle Temple in the late 1620s, Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon, admitted that the license of these times was very exorbitant. One lawyer grumpily wrote to his friend in 1613 that his son is at the Middle Temple, where he hath a chamber and study, but I hear he studieth the law very little. And this was a reference to Thomas Carey, who became quite a well-known Cavalier poet, and who was presumably too busy writing saucy poetry to open his law books. And this is a kind of archetypal embodiment of the inn's gentleman at the time. There's lots of jokes about lawyers being too busy kind of carousing to really uphold the Commonwealth. But despite the element of play and subversion, the inns were considered a key node in the realm's intellectual networks. So the poet and colonizer Edmund Spenser called them bricky towers where studious lawyers have their bowers. And Thomas Churchyard wrote in 1580 that in London dwell the sages of the world and all the muses nine at the inns of court where wit and knowledge flows. So Emily and I have been interested in thinking about how travel literature, knowledge about other parts of the world, and literary sociability all merge at the inns in this moment where the English are also establishing their colonies in the Atlantic for the first time, starting with the successful establishment of Jamestown in 1607. Many explorers, travelers, and pro-colonial writers, such as Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, and Francis Bacon, were closely associated with the inns. William Strachey, a secretary in Virginia, dedicated his history of the travel into Virginia to Francis Bacon in 1612 and offered himself to Bacon's service because, as he said, I am bound to your observance, being one of Gray's Inn society, where your lordship ever approved of the Virginia plantation. So perhaps soothed by the sea greens and blues of the library itself, we began to think more about these flows that Churchill had referred to, thinking about the inn's position near the Thames and the kind of the opening up of kind of the possibilities of kind of travel and exploration that opened up, thinking about the city's waterways and how they connected gentlemen to the world of trade and navigation beyond. So this interest in the global is evident in a rather fitting set of objects that sit in the library. And that's these Molineux globes that you see in this image here. So I'm going to hand over to Emily now to give us an overview of these globes and the idea of networks that the exhibition is founded on.
Thank you very much, Loraine, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to begin, as Loraine said, by going into some more detail about the Molineux globes and the concepts of these networks. So the globes you see here are currently held in the Middle Temple. And I could get the next slide, please, Loraine. And another one, please. Thank you very much. The current globes that you can see on your screen in the top left are another example of Molineux globes, which are currently held at Petworth House. The ones at the Middle Temple are very similar, but with the globes at Petworth House, there are images of these really fascinating details that you can see, the fish and the mermaid person. So the Molineux globes are the first known pair of celestial and terrestrial globes to have been made in England. The pair held in the Middle Temple are the only known surviving pair by Emery Molyneux, a mathematician and craftsman. They were constructed using flour paste, which was designed specifically to leave them unaffected by humidity while they were at sea, and each globe measures around 2 feet across. These globes could have served a practical purpose, but they were so expensive it seems unlikely they ever boarded a ship. When they were new in 1603, they would have cost £20 each, which in modern currency is around £2,757. How they eventually arrived in the Middle Temple is unclear, so the earliest record of them there dates to 1717, but there is a reference to the two Molyneux globes in a pamphlet printed in London in 1609, so they have a mysterious 100 years or so in the city. These two globes displayed the most geographically up-to-date knowledge, and they were dedicated to Elizabeth I by Molyneux's patron, the wealthy London merchant William Sanderson. Sanderson was very keenly interested in geography and maps, and he named 3 of his sons, Raleigh, Cavendish and Drake, after famous contemporary explorers. Molyneux's globes highlight the discoveries specifically of English Elizabethan travellers, with Francis Drake and Thomas Cavendish's circumnavigations displayed on them, along with the failed English colony in Roanoke, South Carolina, and John Cabot's 1497 journey to Newfoundland. To create them, Molyneux consulted with various early modern experts to get the details perfect, including the geographer Richard Hakluyt, who has been the focus of most of my research with TIDE, the cartographer Edward Wright, and Walter Raleigh. The pair of globes therefore represent a direct link between the inns and the personal and financial networks which surrounded American colonization in early modern London. They serve as almost totemic objects displaying the world as the Elizabethans believed, or perhaps more accurately, wished it to be. The decoration you can see here, the mermaid and the fish, highlight the risks and rewards that were associated with this travel, the process of gaining the world through knowledge, with the potential of goods and knowledge being brought back, continually considered alongside the threat posed to sailors by the unknown. These networks were essential for disseminating knowledge, capital and goods. The importance of the social connections behind this process of geographic discovery is clear from William Sanderson's familial ties and the names he gave his children, while the importance of knowledge dissemination is clear from Molyneux's reliance on geographers and experts in creating his globes. And this question of networks and social networks has been really essential for mine and Loraine's work on the exhibition, and I think a key founding principle of our work on it. They represent a vital intersection between the personal, professional and financial connections which underpinned the early English links to America and the world. Now, part of my doctoral research as a member of TIDE has evolved examining these social networks through social network maps, which are useful for representing complex social communities and examining sub-communities. And there's an example of one of these shown later next to one of Loraine's globes, which I'm personally very excited about. So in that sense, our work on the exhibition has been really key for countering the effect that you can sometimes have with these maps, where social networks are flattened, putting them back into conversation with globes and physical items. And as Loraine said earlier, a world held in a hand has been really vital for expanding our understanding. Could I have the previous slide again, please, Loraine? Thank you very much. So one of the key moments for me that typifies this connection between globes, the Middle Temple and the expanding world appears in one of the key geographic texts of the period, which will feature in the exhibition, which is the Principal Navigations of the English Nation by the geographer Richard Hakluyt, who was one of Molyneux's consulted experts. In the first edition of Principal Navigations in 1589, Hakluyt retells the story of his visit as a child to his cousin's room at the Middle Temple. He describes his cousin had lying open on his table a book of cosmography with a universal map. And seeing that the young Hakluyt was interested, his cousin began to take him on a global tour, pointing out all the seas, bays, gulfs, capes, empires and kingdoms it depicted, before explaining what special commodities each of these places provided and what in turn they needed from England. From this map, he directed young Hakluyt to a Bible, turned to Psalm 107 and read to him that they which go down into the sea in ships and occupy by the great waters, they see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. So the map currently shown on your screen is a contemporary map by the same cartographer who had created this universal map that so inspired young Hakluyt. And the scale really shows you how impressive it must have been to see in that chamber and how overwhelming I think that knowledge of the world would have been. This experience made so great an impression on Hakluyt, who was around 16 years old at the time, that he resolved himself to dedicate his life to the study and dissemination of such knowledge. The map in question, which originally sparked this interest, had been made by a mapmaker from Antwerp, Abraham Ortelius, who was good friends with his cousin. So when you delve into these connections, this tale becomes a moment where global networks are key, with the English Hakluyt relying on a map made by a man from Antwerp to bring him the world. And if I can move back to Loraine, I think it's fair to say that that concept of looking into a very apparently straightforward moment and suddenly realizing the huge expansive connections behind it has been quite typical for our experience so far, putting together the exhibition.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. I'm really keen to bring Loraine into the conversation, but just before we do, we thought we would just offer you a few snippets of some of the archival material that we're bringing into the exhibition, because I think some of these will feed into what Loraine will refer to as she goes forward. I should also say that we do have a catalogue coming, and it will be free to download from our website. So the catalogue will feature a lot more of the works that we have in the physical exhibition, some that we're not able to fit in there that we wish that we could have, and also some of Loraine's pieces will be featured in there as well. So do keep an eye out for that. So this kind of document on the left is a really brilliant record from 1586, from the minutes of Parliament at the Middle Temple, which documents how Francis Drake, when he returned from his raids on the Spanish West Indies in August 1586, came into the Middle Temple Hall at dinner time, where he was enthusiastically met with applause and where benchers greeted him with great joy. So I think it gives us a really nice snapshot into the enthusiasm that gentlemen at the inns had for these explorers and the kind of goods and knowledge that they carried back with them on their ships. And there's an image of a replica of the Golden Hind there as well. And that image on the bottom of the lantern is known as the Drake lantern, and it still hangs in Middle Temple Hall, and is said to have come from Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, which circumnavigated the globe in 1577 to 1580. This is some marginalia from the barrister Robert Ashley's copy of Dudley Diggs's 1615 Defence of Trade. And Emily and I are very indebted to Renee Satterley, the librarian at Middle Temple, for bringing our attention to this really marvelous bit of marginalia, as Renee does a lot of work on Robert Ashley and his collections. Ashley copied out some of the commodities brought into England by the Dragon, which he says is an old worn ship brought by the East India Company, but by their cost made so strong that she has now gone on her 5th voyage to the Indies. And so you might be able to make out some of the goods that are listed there. They include sugar, diamonds, pepper, raw silk, cotton, and cinnamon. So this marginalia offers these global goods being brought back into the realm. And the way that there's that kind of manuscript culture and kind of printed book culture kind of working together in a really interesting way, as gentlemen rely on letters and political networks as well as printed books to help them make investments and gain practical knowledge. We also wanted to include these images here. So the one kind of slightly below is the German physician Johann Meanders' Tabacologia from 1622. And the one on the left is from the Dutch naturalist Willem Piso's Natural History of Brazil from 1648. These images jumped out at me especially because they demonstrate the human labor which lay behind the access to and consumption of plantation goods. The Neander images show a very pastoral harmony with happy tobacco pickers filling their baskets with the plant. In Piso's engraving, enslaved Africans extract and boil the juice of sugarcane while a white overseer looks on. So these images, of course, don't evoke the actual conditions of life on sugar and tobacco plantations, but they do nonetheless bring enslaved Africans and Native Americans into what scholars have called the world making of this period and of English gentlemen. So it was really important for us in the exhibition to explore this element of dispossession, of exploitation involved in early Stuart projects. And it's something that we'll probably discuss a bit later as well. But Loraine has found really brilliant ways of alluding to these elements in her work as well. And I'll just close with one final image. I wanted to mention feathers, as this will help explain the context for another one of Loraine's pieces. I've long been fascinated by the playwright George Chapman's memorable Masque, which was staged in 1613 to celebrate the wedding of James I's daughter, Elizabeth Stuart, to Frederick V of Bohemia. This masque was organized and financed by gentlemen of the Middle Temple and Lincoln's Inn, and featured 50 gentlemen parading before James I and his court at Whitehall, wearing, as the printed description reads, strange hoods of feathers, silver embroidered with golden suns, a trail of gold imitating Indian work, ruffs of feathers spangled with pearl, and on their heads high-sprigged feathers, like the Virginian princes they represented. And these performative elements are really intriguing to me because we see gentlemen performing their own status and civility through a complex act of mimesis, where they're kind of gaining inspiration and seeking to replicate images of indigeneity, but using often European-made fabrics and techniques of making. So in the exhibition, we wanted to put a discussion of the masque alongside images of Indigenous featherwork of the kind that I've been kind of examining at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and also with this Aztec manuscript, which has a connection to Richard Hakluyt. It's the Codex Mendoza, which Hakluyt acquired from the French geography André Thévet in his travels to Paris. The Codex is believed to have been created around 1541 and depicts the importance of feathers in the lifeways of pre-conquest Aztec society. So we wanted to kind of bring in these sources to think about the function of feathers in Indigenous societies, because that's important to understanding the politics of appropriation that happen in the masque, as gentlemen relay these fantasies of Indigenous peoples submitting to, as one verse goes, the knights of the virgin land who sparkle with grace at your discoveries. So much of the exhibition is kind of thinking about the kind of fantasies and the literary imagination that gentlemen have, and also how different kinds of knowledge and customs and ways of life play into that, and how we can read into those tensions. So I'll stop there, and Loraine, it would be great to bring you in now and to ask you a bit of questions. And we thought before we jump too much into specifics of our collaboration, we wanted to take the opportunity as well to ask you just a bit more about how you got into the work that you do in the first place. So yeah, I thought, can we just start with that, and can you maybe just set the scene for us a little bit and tell us how you got interested in globes and in porcelain as well?
Sure, thank you, and thank you very much for the invite to take part. This has been like a fascinating process for me, and I'm looking forward to discussing our collaboration shortly. Yeah, initially, as a childhood fascination with clay, I loved the materiality of it, and with maps also there was the physicality of the folded paper map, but the prospect of adventure. I think my first contact with maps was really family holidays, ordnance surveys on the beach, sort of planning a day trip out. So for a very early age, maps became the notion of adventure, and these tiny marks and things became ideas for possibilities, whether it was a cliff or a cafe or whatever. But it was just that sense of travel and voyage. And I think through when I was at college and I was working at clay, I suddenly sort of made this connection between this abundant resource of the ground and taking that and using that to make representations of the landscape it was from. So it just sort of, the things kind of click together. And also porcelain has a very, there's a lot of porcelain clay used in production of paper on which maps are printed. So I quite liked this sort of circularity of that.
That's amazing, thank you. Emily, do you want to jump in with a question, and how shall we kind of trade these off? Or
Yes, please. I mean, I love that image of the connection between paper and clay and the maps looking at the earth and being used to create the globes. It's such a wonderful image of that circularity. But I was intrigued on how you developed those technical skills, because having seen some of your work, some of the cartographic maps are very complex. I was wondering how you acquired those skills that are required to engage with the more mathematical or scientific side. And also how you would approach the idea of space in the globes as well, particularly with some of your celestial globes that chart the sky or the moon.
Yeah, so I didn't, when I was at school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know, I just knew that I didn't want to be in an office. I knew I was a maker, I wanted to physically make stuff. But I think, like the experience of having ordnance survey maps in my life as a young child, my father was an engineering draftsman who was a freelancer and quite often would work from home. So he had a drawing board and he had imagery. So I very early age connected this idea of lines on paper representing three-dimensional space and the idea of scale. And he was working on a project once for, I think it wasn't Hammersmith Flyover because that was a little bit before him, but a flyover somewhere important on a motorway in the UK, and he made a cardboard model of it, and cardboard and bits of wire and stuff, and we had that on the dining table for a while, and I was just like, wow, this is, you know. And he was great at explaining how things worked, and I always wanted to know how stuff worked. So I think from a very early age that there was that sort of kind of scientific understanding of scale and how things could be three-dimensional things could be represented in 2 dimensions. And the other half of my childhood, of course, was my wonderful mother, who sadly passed away far too young, but had she lived beyond her early 30s, she would have been a geography teacher. That's what she wanted to do, it's her passion. So all of these things combined, and when we were sort of uprooted by her early departure and we came back to London to live with my grandparents, I left school very young. And I was looking through the Evening Standard thinking, well, I need to get a job, what do I do? And I remember seeing this job advert and said to my dad, cartographer, is that maps? He said, oh yeah, you'd like that, it's drawing maps, you'd like that. So I applied, and just, yeah, these sort of things don't happen. I applied and I got the job, and it was working at Birkbeck University and Birkbeck College, part of London University, as an apprentice cartographer. And, you know, in the day when there were apprenticeships. So I was very lucky that I went in, and because my kind of strengths at school had been geography, maths and art, it just sort of, the things were just sort of gelled, really. And so I studied cartography whilst I was working at Birkbeck, and that was fascinating. It was just, I love that academic world, and it's very nice to be back working with academics again. But at Birkbeck, because it's an evening college, all of the academics there have their own research fields. So I was drawing maps that was anything that was representing sort of social geography, to hydrogeomorphology in the African Rift Valley, to sort of more environmental things of incidences of saxifrage above the Arctic. So I was drawing all these maps for other people, and it just seemed to me like they're having all the fun. They're the guys that are going out there and doing all the research, and I'm sat in this office just off Tottenham Court Road going, get the pens out then. And I just wanted to do some physical. So after I'd qualified and after a number of years, and as cartography was moving into digital and online stuff, I just thought, I don't want to be sat in front of a computer screen, ironically. And so I ran away and did a ceramics degree at Central St Martin's, and it was there that I thought, well, I'm never going to draw a straight line again, and wanted to make things sort of very free and loose in ceramics, you know, inspired by the landscape. But it was in my final year that something just sort of clicked, and thought, hang on a minute, how about, you know, I can use this material to represent the earth at scale, and it's everything that I do has kind of stemmed from that moment, really.
I love that. That's really, it's a really beautiful homage to your mother that you made there, and also the idea of apprenticeship just kind of has a nice resonance with kind of early modern craftsmanship, and just, you know, how you find your calling or your place in a guild or in a society. It's really interesting. You've mentioned this word a few times, so I thought that I might pick up on it, and that's that idea of scale. And when we've spoken before, it's made me think of the character in The Tempest who says that I think he will carry this island home in his pocket and give it to his son for an apple. And there's so much fascination in the Renaissance with that, the microcosm and the macrocosm, the links between the global and the individual, how a globe can be carried in a pocket, and yet we kind of contain multitudes and have the cosmos within us. And I just wondered if you could say a bit more about how you engage, how you come to terms with and engage with these ideas of scale, particularly as I think one of your work adopts a scale of 170 million? Is that the, yeah.
Yeah, these little guys are at a scale of 1 to 170 million. Yeah, I love that that quote from The Tempest. And there's also another quote that I stumbled across at college many years ago, and I can never remember it verbatim, but there's a Da Vinci quote about the man is called by the ancients the earth in miniature, and there's a lovely analogy in that about as the lungs rise and fall in breathing, so the seas rise and fall with the tides. And I just love that kind of the romance of seeing yourself within the world and seeing the world within yourself and other people and those connections. And I think sort of more, you know, a more contemporary sort of version of that was Ray and Charles Eames' Power of 10 film that they made in the I think it was 50s or 60s, I can't remember the exact date, but it sort of starts I think with a couple lying on it's just like a 10-foot square with a couple lying on a beach next to the lake in Chicago, and then it sort of zooms out and zooms out and zooms out and zooms out, and then you're out in the cosmos, and then it comes right back in and then goes molecular. And the wonderful thing about that film is about how often patterns repeat themselves. So for the veins in a leaf to the branches of the tree to the roots of the tree, but also you see a similar connection with, you know, human veins in the lungs and so on. So I've always been sort of interested in that sort of sense of scale, but there are other artists that do things like that a lot better than I do. But what I wanted to do was apply that to landscape and earth. And I think the thing with cartography is all cartography, every aspect of it, you're always editing things out, and you're always kind of, what is the focus of this? What is this map going to be used for? Or in my case, what is this piece about? What do I want people to get from this? What do they want? What do I want the resonances to be? So it's about just picking out those bits of detail that are going to mean something in abstract or on their own, and then in some cases amplifying the scale so you can see, so it can make sense. So with the globes, for example, the height scale is exaggerated about 70 times because the earth would be smoother than a billiard ball at that scale. But I wanted people to see the notion of where the mountains are, you know, compared to the oceans and the islands and so on. Right.
It leads me very nicely into to my question, which was that your globes have these, some of them have these wonderful cases, very intricate, detailed cases that you make for them. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the relationship between the globes and the cases and how you see that kind of figured in your work.
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure. I've lost my screen now, so I don't know. There's some slides. There were some slides that can come up that sort of illustrate this, I think.
I can, yeah, I'll share my screen again.
So the next slide, I think. Yeah. So the idea of the case is really that these pocket globes, I started making these about 10 years ago, and they are inspired really in part by the early modern pocket globes and the sort of 17th and 18th century pocket globes, which were made of paper on plaster and were incredibly fragile. And so they had these little leather cases that protected them. And what I didn't want to just kind of make a replica of those. What I wanted to do is to make a pocket globe that said something about where we are, where we are in the world now and at this point in time. And actually porcelain is quite robust. A lot of people think of it as being quite fragile. But actually, I know from experience that if you drop one of those globes on a wooden floor, they do actually bounce, which is surprising. Not so on a concrete floor, unfortunately. But the cases in this context were more, so the porcelain themselves didn't need the case to protect it. But what I wanted to do was to make a sort of a comment. I wanted people to feel that they were fragile and that they needed protection in the case. And it's really, so although being inspired by the antique pocket globes, I'm really looking at it as a commentary on the fact that we've all got Google Earth. We've all got the world now in our phones, in our pockets. So the pocket globe in a way is now digital and it lives in our phones. And what I wanted to do is make something tangible that reflected that, but also that sort of served as a reminder that we have the care of the world in our hands now. But it's up to us to do something about it and to make to make a conscious decisions. And that's what the case is about. This piece is called 24 Karat Earth, and it is about our relationship to value and what we value and how we care for things.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. I'll stop sharing again just because I think that allows people to keep track of us, our little faces on the screen, and the conversation a bit better until we share next. But I do love that. I love that element of you really thinking about what it means to understand the world today and our responsibilities towards it, and the kind of looking back to earlier periods, but also being able to put a bit of pressure or critique some of the ideas about the world that existed then. One thing that I also was really struck by looking at your pieces is the celestial as well as the terrestrial globes that you have. And I was wondering how in your work you think about that connection between the celestial and the terrestrial, because I think particularly as historians, we in general seem to kind of latch onto the ones that show land and the sea kind of much more than we do thinking about the skies. And so just how you make that kind of connection between those different kinds of globes in your art.
That's a really good question. I'm glad I've had a little bit of time to think about this, so thank you. But to me, it was sort of like a logical connections that these two globes historically have existed side by side. Like Blau made celestial, and they've most of the globe makers made them as a pair. And I think the celestial globe sort of marks our position on Earth. It marks our position in the universe, and it just sort of, to me, it just thinks, you need to know where you are in order to be able to navigate to somewhere else. And the celestial globe sort of historically did that. And even up until very recently, all the Admiralty ships still had celestial globes on them in case the GIS stuff failed. And the majority of kind of captains, like yacht masters, I think, have to know their celestial navigation still, because it's reliable. It will help you navigate your way across the oceans. And so I think historically there's always been this connection with the celestial and the terrestrial globe, because one without the other doesn't, sort of, they're lovely objects, but the connection, the way of using them for voyage doesn't work unless you've got both. But in terms of kind of my work and how it just felt right to have this miniature globe with a kind of a case with the stars within it, because even though the majority of it, I have no idea how to navigate by the stars. I know roughly where things should be, but I just think from a personal point of view, most people have some sort of connection with understanding where the plough is, or we're up here in the northern hemisphere. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it's the Southern Cross. so most people have a basic connection with knowing some of the constellations, and there's sort of a significant, there can be personal significances with a constellation marking a particular place in time. So it just felt that they, you know, it's the thing that all of us on Earth have in common, is that we have those stars to look out on. We have that view. You know, it changes depending on where you are on the globe, but we've all got that view.
We all look up and see the same stars.
Yeah.
That is such a lovely formulation, which leads me very nicely actually into asking if there are any other types of globes that you'd like to make in the future, or any other elements of cartography that you'd like to further work with, because I know you've got such a fascinating range of work that you've produced.
Yeah, it's quite an eclectic mix. I think I've been accused of being quite eclectic in the past, because it just depends what I'm interested in, and because the field of cartography and the world is just so vast, it depends on what I'm working towards, what my focus is. But the thing that underpins everything that I do is I really think that the maps that we're exposed to influence our worldview and how we see our place in the world and our sense of belonging, and also what we see as other, and where we see boundaries and how we see boundaries, and the problems that incur. So that's the sort of thing that underpins all the work that I do. After Middle Temple, I'm working towards a show next year, which I can't talk about yet, because it's not in the public domain, but I'm very excited about it, because it's an opportunity to build on the work that I've done for Middle Temple, but rather than looking at how the globes and maps influence the Elizabethan, Stuarts and Jacobeans, I'm looking at the last 100 years. So from a time when my grandparents would have been at school, how they were taught geography, how they were taught about British Empire, how they were taught about colonialism, and the shift in 100 years, and the shifts that still need to happen in terms of how we look at those things and how we relate to the other people who within our worldview or within our framework. And I'm actually working with a digital cartographer at the moment. We're looking at we're exploring the possibility of doing an interactive digital thing, which will go with these new experimental ceramic pieces. But I'm just dissecting the globe in different ways to show how connected, not how divided, the land masses on the planet are.
I like that idea of not just changing matter or the things you're working on, but just the perspective on it can give us so many different interpretations of it already. I would like to maybe greedily move on to kind of exhibition related questions, but just to close this bit, just out of curiosity, do you have a favorite globe that you've made in the past? Because you've made so many beautiful pieces in so many different media, and I don't know if it is kind of the original kind of pocket globes that kind of keep you bored, or if there's something else.
Yeah, I mean it depends on my current thinking and what I'm working towards, but I think my forever favorite is now going to be not this particular globe, but an earlier version of this, which I call Solid Ground, which was so as well as been inspired by Google Earth and historic pocket globes, my work was also inspired by the Apollo missions. As a very small child, I sat up with my dad, and he was so excited about the Apollo landings, and it just really he was so enthusiastic about the human achievement, about the science and the skill and the thinking and the exploration, all of those sort of things. I mean, there's all sorts of other notions which I'm now kind of questioning, but so when I started thinking about making globes, I was originally looking at antique globes, but then I was looking at that fabulous image of the blue marble, where you which has only been seen by the Apollo astronauts, and then I got to meet one of them, which was pretty spectacular. And he very kindly instantly recognized that that's what this was about, and took a globe home. So he had one of these on his desk, and then the next year we met again at the same event, a New Scientist Live, and he asked me to make some a limited edition to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Apollo landings, which, you know, it's not every day you get asked by an astronaut to make stuff. So I think that has to be probably my favourite, is the idea of making a globe for somebody who's actually seen the world from that viewpoint.
Is there an image that you wanted to share for that?
Yeah, there is on one of the slides. If you scroll through, I think it's the next but one. So next one there. No, if you go back on that one. So that's Colonel Al Warden, who was Apollo 15 command module pilot, and it's actually the 50th anniversary. So 50 years ago today, he was circumnavigating the moon. And I just love this. You know, I've been trying to kind of tell both of these stories on social media recently, and I just thought, oh, this is marvelous. I'm working on something that's 394 years apart. And for Middle Temple, I'm looking at Drake's circumnavigation, which took 3 years. And 50 years ago, some 394 years later, this lovely man who I was so lucky to meet was, he circumnavigated the moon 75 times in about 5 days. So.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And I love that, the kind of, because I think about that a lot as well, the idea of when we think about the equivalent today to maybe understanding the fascination with global exploration in the 16th and 17th centuries, I think we often do kind of, it makes us think about space and the idea of space being that unknowable that now we are trying to grapple with. So there's so many parallels there, I think, to unpick. But I mean, it's been so much fun to be in this privileged position of kind of bringing out some archival material and then just letting you have fun with it and do whatever you want to do with the material that we've been uncovering. And it really has made us think about and reflect a bit differently, I think, on the materials that we've looked at as well. But just to kind of set the scene and maybe picking up on what Emily was talking about with the Molyneux globes, I was really struck even looking at examples of pocket globes from the later 17th century when they really start to take off in England. They often, even then in the 1670s and 1680s, have the voyages of Francis Drake and Thomas Cavendish on the globes. And you kind of get a sense of this patriotic interest in Elizabethan voyages, even in the later 17th century. So to start, I mean, I wonder if you could just say a bit more about how these voyages, the kind of Elizabethan voyages, played a role in how you kind of conceived of your pieces for the exhibition, if they did at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been so illuminating working with you both and the materials that you've selected. So it's, I mean, my initial interest with Molyneux globes was just the incredible craft skill of their production, the science behind them, the craft skill of their making, the skill of the engraver. So that was my original fascination with those globes. And then the texts that you've selected and working alongside, it's just completely illuminated these voyages and put the globes into context. So in wanting to make a piece, I made a few pieces a few years ago called Modern Molyneux, which just was basically just looking at a globe with a simplified version of the frame. And I thought initially that's what I was going to be doing for this exhibition. But your work has just moved my work in a complete sideways step. And what I wanted to do was just go, okay, there is so much on these globes. I just want to pick out one thing from it and make an installation which is based on the marks on that globe. And so what I've selected was Drake's circumnavigation. And thanks to Emily's work as well, I have to put my hands up here, and I'd never heard of Hackler before away from you guys, and now I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I bought some kind of, you know, some cheap eBay modern versions of it because I just want to know more now. I really want to know more about it. And so what I decided to do is just kind of peel, and obviously I can't touch the globes, but Renee and Middle Temple have very kindly given me their complete photographic survey of the globes. So I've been able to work from material, and it's just like having this amazing window into these things that are quite rightly behind glass. They're so precious and so fragile. But to be able to look in detail at that surface, but also to put the contemporary text together with it. There's the next slide actually just shows my work in progress for this. So I'm working with that's the one. So that's on the left, the pieces as I was making them. That's 3, there'll be about 27, 28, I think, in total. That will be along the back of the cabinet with your purses and souls texts. But each piece is, initially they were going to be cylindrical, and the more I've looked at the surface of the globe and the imagery, I wanted to give an idea of movement and of the sort of wind in the sails. So I very loosely made the cylinders with a slab, and then I literally blew into them. So I've inflated them to give the form. But what I also wanted to do by that inflating and blowing back into them was some sort of metaphorical way of trying to give a voice to the unheard and to the stories that haven't been written. But on one side, on one face of each piece is a section of Drake's Voyage, and they tell the whole circumnavigation. And on the reverse of the same piece, I've hand inscribed the text, which in fact that comes to my next question to Emily actually. I bought a Penguin Classic book that they've said was written by Richard Hakluyt, but I now know from you guys that it wasn't actually written by him, but which tells a diary account of that circumnavigation. So what I've tried to do is to match bits of text with that part of the voyage, and then each piece will be glazed in the interior with a kind of colour coding depending on what they picked up on that part of their journey. So there's kind of multi-layered things. I'm slightly nervous that I've got a month to finish this. But yeah, that sort of, I wanted to ask Emily about Hakluyt, and because sort of I'm an armchair traveller myself and sort of fascinated with maps and their motivational appeal. And you described earlier how Hakluyt visited his elder cousin and saw this inspirational map. Do you think, sort of coupled with that reading of Psalm 107, do you think his contemporaries felt that they had a spiritual backing for their exploration and conquests?
I think so. It's really been one of the great privileges for me as part of this collaboration to talk with you about work on Hakluyt and network maps and putting it on globes. It's honestly been an honour because I'm in awe of your work. And Hakluyt is, I'm very, very fascinated with Hakluyt, but Principal Navigations is huge and often quite dull. So I think at times it feels like you have to dig into it to find the kind of the gems coming through. And it's been wonderful to see those in your work. But yeah, that story of him coming to Middle Temple and seeing the map for the first time is really one of the key moments. And there is some debate about whether it really happened or not, because it's just such a perfect moment. But I think it's something that we've talked about before. The thing that's really vital there is that it's the story, that's where he locates the beginning of his interest, and that map, he connects it to the Middle Temple. And Hakluyt himself he wasn't a full-time geographer in probably quite typical academic parlance. He was a part-time geographer, and the rest of the time he was a minister in the church. He had various positions across the country, so he worked in Bristol and London and in Suffolk. So he was a preacher as well, producing sermons and religious texts. And it's quite clear in his work that there's a religious element to his work on geography. He obviously thought it was a vital part of his ministry, I think, to disseminate this travel information. But it also, yeah, it all comes back to that Psalm reference with they that go down on the ships, they see the works of the Lord, that these merchants who are traveling off in ships to go and bring goods back, they're like the marginalia that we saw earlier with the reference to the dragon ship. They are doing some kind of spiritual work for England as well. So it's a real combination of influences and interests that create this hugely patriotic work, which, yeah, it's been wonderful to see displayed in your art. And I love those pieces, the Francis Drake pieces going across. I mean, I sympathise with you. I'm having so many to finish, but I can't wait to see them all.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a bit sort of scary. I sort of quite often do this. I set myself a really ambitious target, and they go, "Oh my goodness, is that the time?"
Yeah, I think it does make me think of our really initial conversations where we thought like, oh, we'll just, you know, have a few texts, maybe a few globes, and then it's just blossomed into this really beautiful array of in which the source material that we've selected and the artworks just really feed into the interpretation of each other. I can't really imagine one without the other anymore.
Yeah, likewise. I think that's why I wanted to try and recreate this sort of at the same time that it's on at the Middle Temple. I'm trying to do some sort of parallel exhibition in my studio that will be publicly accessible. And sorry, I just wanted to, another question for you both really, was Loraine, you said in your Inns of Court seminar, you said it's important to think about what colonialism distinctly brings to the culture of the inns, and your concern with global networks is sought to resist flattening the distinct power dynamics that existed as the English engaged with various politics around the world. Do you think as Mercator's map became more widespread, that must have had an influence, and with its exaggerated scale of the UK and Northern Europe compared to the African continent and Latin America, and gives a sort of a distorted sense of comparative power? Do you think there are any sources that sort of reflect this sense of distortion? Do you think that had any impact on these voyages?
Yeah, I think that's such a fruitful, it's a difficult, or like a very thorny question, but I think it's really fruitful to think about. You know, we often talk about the influence of maps or the influence of literature, and actually trying to drill down and see where those influences really were, I think is really important. I think, for example, I mean, I'm not sure about the Mercator map, but there are maps made by cartographers within the kind of Raleigh, Hacklet kind of network. So Edward Wright's, for example, map of 1600, where the emphasis is really on Spanish America and Central and South America, which is not something that we tend to associate with the colonial project in the early 17th century as much as with North America. And yet the Memorable Mask, for example, really has a lot of focus on silver mines. And even though it mentions Virginian Indians, the kind of headdresses seem to be a bit more South American. And you do get a sense that perhaps certain masks and performances are really influenced by a map that someone may have come across, and the kind of imaginaries that those bring. But I think, as you and Emily have been talking about this, the kind of hopes and fantasies that are put onto maps to try to relay a reality that just isn't quite there, or the way that things are depicted is really important to remember. So a lot of colonial maps show forts and settlements where they don't actually exist in real life. And so, yeah, it's difficult to get to how much the explorations that are happening on the ground are actually reflected on a very specific level on the wider maps as well.
Yeah.
Emily, I didn't know if do you have any thoughts on that?
The the detail that I always want to bring in whenever anyone references the memorable mask is a wonderful story which you told in your book, Loraine, about the Inns courtier who had a costume for a mask at the Inns of Court and refused to return it. And then there are documents in the Inn's record saying, can someone please hunt him down and try and get his costume back? And I love the image of someone, I mean, obviously we don't know what he did with the costume, but the thought of him wearing that costume, walking down the Strand in the heart of London, kind of the image of all of these influences brought together on one person in a costume has always been a really powerful one for me.
I suppose one thing that we've kind of spoken about, and it'd be nice to get a bit more of your thoughts on, Loraine, are the kind of geopolitics of these global networks. And this is kind of a lot to unpick, I think, in the time that we have. But globes, although they're a source of fascination and wonder, often seem to kind of occlude the exploitation that lies behind trafficking and exchange. And it's something we try to bring out in the material, in the display. But I thought you explored it really well in the globes, and also some of the objects that frame the globes, that the globes sit on. So I wondered if you wanted to say a few things about that, and it might be time to share some more images for that as well.
Yeah, if you don't mind, yes, that'd be great. I think that it should be the next slide. Yes, that one. So I've got another question for you as well in a sec, Loraine, about this, but the opportunities to work with other materials just seem like the logical thing to do in this instance, because my work's known for being globes. What I wanted to do, well, I thought, well, if I just make globes, and there's different ways I can kind of colour them or do things, but what I really wanted to do is to have something that draws the viewer in and engages them, and thinks, that something that could be lush, but then hopefully you look at it and kind of question the value of those materials and the longer term consequences, or the consequences at the time, the time period that we're looking at, but also the long-term consequences of some of those things. And so I was delighted when you your kind of the early kind of discussions that we had when you selected the case materials and you'd picked the kind of the codex and mentioned feathers, because I had absolutely no idea. I had never given any thought to the use of feathers in this society, although of course I know that the indigenous use of feathers, but I'd never made the connection with them being in a masking court. I'd never heard of masks before, so that was just like, wow, I've really got to explore this, and not wanting to kind of break any kind of sustainability rules or anything else. I thought, okay, well, I need UK sourced feathers. I'm going to buck the trend with this one, UK sourced feathers, and to make this sort of feathered nest, if you like, and to support the globe. Just because I wanted to think about how the feathers in particular, how did they go from being in something that was brought back from explorations to being a material that was engaged with by in these masks at the inns. And then how long did that take before those feathers became something that everybody would have in their hats? How long did it take for these fashions to become established from something that was found, brought in, appropriated, and then shared? Is there any kind of references to the time period of how long it would take for that to become a fashionable thing?
Yeah, it's the kind of trade in feathers is really intriguing, because they are, there are trades happening within Europe, with Africa, with ostrich feathers, for example, which are often used in fans. So if you look at a portrait of Elizabeth I, she's often holding a fan that's made of ostrich feathers. But it is really intriguing to me the way that men and women seem to really want to make a distinction between the feathers that they get in these kind of more long-standing medieval kind of classical associations with, you know, the old world, as they would call it, and the feathers that they might gain through conquest and colonization. So there are woodcuts from the 17th century that depict the English acquiring feathers from indigenous peoples through warfare, because they're aware that often indigenous feathers are a symbol of bravery and sovereignty. So I think there is kind of something political to that appropriation there, where they realize that because feathers are so important to indigenous cultures, it's why kind of taking them and bringing them back says something quite distinct about power dynamics that just acquiring a parrot from a ship or something wouldn't quite have the same kind of resonance.
And the other material that you picked up was this is that one of the supper bills from Middle Temple, and so what I wanted to do is to make a piece which is also on the same slide, which just looked at some of the detail from Molyneux's globe. So taking an element of Molyneux's globe, and this refers back to a question you asked me earlier about dealing with scale. And with cartography, you edit and amplify what you want the viewer to share. And I had never considered before, sort of looking at the supper bills. Obviously, I'm aware of the slave trade, but not in as much detail as I should have been. And looking at Molyneux's globe again, looking at these detailed surveys, I noticed for the first time really that, and I've subsequently gone back and checked and looked at some of the porcelain charts of the same period. When we draw rivers now on a map, like contemporary cartography, because of the scale of the map, you would draw the river as a single line. So it would just show, yeah, that's a river, we know that's a river. The interesting thing on Molyneux's globe and the porcelains at that time is they're shown as a parallel line, and it becomes a road map. It's a route map. And I wanted to pick out a particular detail, and this is the West African coast, showing, and part of this isn't so much from Drake's circumnavigation. This is Molyneux's globe, but it's showing a detail of it, showing these routes up the river. And in the little pamphlet book that I read at the time, they were discussing Drake. They found safe harbour, and he erected a pinnace of which he'd brought 4 with him ready framed from England. And I had to look up what the pinnace was, and it's a small ship, and it's a small ship so you can go up rivers. And it just put into context, so like, oh, okay, that's why the rivers are drawn like that on this globe. That's why the rivers are, because it's going, look, you can go here, and you can go and, you know, there are Spanish fishermen up here, there are Spanish colonies up here. They've already enslaved these people. It's easy, you go that way. You know, it was just a bit of it was a real eye-opener, kind of looking back at that detail on the globe. So I wanted to make a piece that kind of just brought that to attention, because I've been a cartographer for years, and I'd never really made that connection before about the way that those elements were drawn, which was really highlighting accessibility, really. I wanted to ask about the other thing I've been working with, the other material I've been working with is tobacco leaf, raw tobacco leaf, which I'm now, because of conservation concerns and the fact that tobacco, as I've discovered, stains quite readily. So the actual raw tobacco leaf is not actually going to go into the case after all, but I did import some raw tobacco leaf from Virginia. It smells incredible, and it's just, it made me think about the contemporary trade as well. So something else that I'm kind of including in all of the globes I'm making is I'm putting a contemporary commodity code, because I want people to carry on thinking about trade and trade balance and whatever. But the images you showed earlier of Neander's tabacologia, the plantation was shown as almost like a rural idyll. Do you, and the Piso illustration as well, that even though that's obviously got a slave master in it, they were still kind of very sanitized images. How aware do you think the Inn's gentlemen were of the human cost of this consumption? Do you think there was an awareness of it, or do you think all the imagery was sort of filtered?
That's a question that preoccupies me a lot, and because, as you say, these images are very idyllic, and they demonstrate this kind of pastoral harmony that just does not reflect the brutalities of plantation life, even in the English plantations of the early 17th century. And so on one hand, I think people conveniently choose to ignore the cost of human consumption. And that's probably something that future generations will think about us when they look at the staggering statistics of female labor and modern slavery involved, you know, in making clothes, for example, or in sourcing palm oil. On the other hand, I think, yeah, so I think it does let us kind of hide behind the illusions to exploitation in literature by just kind of dismissing them as metaphors and just ideas about travel that gentlemen had and didn't really necessarily understand. But I always think of John Donne, for example, who often writes of, you know, the Indias of spice and mine in his poetry and things like that. But also that he attempted to become a secretary of Virginia. And so there is a sense in which I think we can never quite disentangle a broader sense of the geopolitics of the period with the kind of literature as well, which I think is something that we really kind of try to grapple with in the exhibition in various ways, and which I think the commodity codes on the tobacco leaf that you have and things like that is such a brilliant way of kind of alluding to those commodity chains and those supply chains that merchants were so involved with. And I think plenty of Inn's gentlemen did very much know about the brutal conditions of Indigenous peoples, just based on allusions and things that they write about in their texts.
It was one of the things that was really important to us putting the material together, was to bring out those ideas of physical process and the labour, and to make sure that it wasn't hidden behind the scenes. So it has been, again, one of the really wonderful aspects of collaboration, I think, is that your work has brought that out in kind of a wonderful conversation with how we've tried to do it in the exhibition. It is such an important point to remember as well, and so easily glossed over, I think, when you only see the social side at the inns and the men smoking tobacco in the corners.
Yeah, I think, and also likewise, because although a lot of my work has, you know, I do try and think about sort of the social side of mapping. You know, primarily I do what I do because I love maps and I love looking at maps, and the quality of early modern cartography is just extraordinary. And so for years I'd just been completely sidelined and just blinkered almost. I wasn't really that bothered about the why and the what and what was happening. So this has just been really brilliant, because the materials that you've chosen then made me think about things, and then it just, you know, it's just been a lovely circular process, sort of working along with you. Can I ask Emily that your network maps, I mean, I just thought that was an incredible way of, you know, visualizing the spread of information and sort of bridging connections between disparate social groups. And I would have never really thought about how those connections sort of enabled. I mean, it's sort of, you know, the cost of making cartography is extortionate. So of course a cartographer would need a sponsor. And I just think, you know, your work on the network maps, and I just wanted to ask you, how did the network maps come about? And do you do the research and make the network map, or do the network maps sort of and your research evolved as does the making of one map then throw up another possible connection?
Well, the network maps, so the image that you can see on the screen is a wonderful image that was sent by Loraine, which is a picture of one of the network maps that's been part of my research with TIDE, next to a globe and a copy of Principal Navigations. And I may well get a picture of this framed at some point because it's just wonderful to see it. But those network maps are essentially social maps of the communities that were surrounding different regions in the 16th century, and particularly Hakluyt's work. So the circles are people and the lines are relationships. And it started as an idea when I started reading Principal Navigations, not when I'd read the whole thing, because that took about a year, but reading it, you really get a picture of these communities and dynamics, and they can be quite hard to tease out of the text because they're printed letters and printed narratives. And I wanted to find a way of representing those communities almost separately to the text, so that you could read a narrative and then see who it had come from and who knew who and how they were connected. And it's a process that required a fair amount of archival research and reading Principal Navigations and then inputting data and creating the maps in special software. And it certainly wasn't my area of research when I started work on TIDE. So it's become something that I've worked on over the last 3 years. And in a way, it's enjoyable to look back and see the development of that process and how the maps have improved. But it's also no accident that all the maps that we're using as part of the exhibition, or the maps that Loraine has worked from, are later maps, because it's really a process that requires that development, I think. And it's been wonderful, as I said, just to see the ways it can be put to use, because it's such a versatile approach, but it can be quite dry, especially within the context of academic research. So being able to see it in 3D in the context of globes and maps has been really wonderful, which actually has a question that I would very much like to ask you, Loraine, having looked through the material in the exhibition. My favourite piece, of course, is Principal Navigations, because at this point it couldn't be anything else. But do you have a favourite piece of material from the exhibition, having looked through it for the last year or so?
God, that's so hard. I think, can I just say all of it? It's really hard to just pick out one thing. I think, I mean, just it was a joy, and you know, thanks again to sort of librarian and archivist Renee for allowing me to go in and take that photograph a few weeks ago, because I was just sort of feeling like, that book's printed in 1598, and I was just, you know, I knew I wasn't going to touch it or anything, but I was just sort of, and I just felt very reverential about being next to this sort of 400-year-old book. But it was wonderful to sort of see that physical thing, to sort of work alongside you guys and help to understand the content of the book. So that's fabulous. And Lauren's choice of the Codex Mendoza, it was just, you know, that's just exquisite. I absolutely love it. And again, the context of why that was being shown. So those things, and of course Molyneux's globes, which is kind of how we ended up on this journey in the first place. But yeah, I think if I had to narrow it down to one thing, it would be those three.
Oh, well, Loraine, that might be a good place to maybe begin to draw the conversation to a close, leaving you know, a sense of joy and wonder at the pieces, a difficulty to narrow down a favorite, and I hope that will invite the people who are listening to hopefully come and see the exhibition if it's possible, given the pandemic, and to look into the exhibition material that we'll have online, and also, of course, to look into your beautiful globes, and perhaps come and visit the exhibition that I think you're still planning to have in your studio. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, it will be. It will be at my my railway art studio in Peckham, and it's going to be open for London Craft Week, which is the 4th to the 10th of October. So it's 2 minutes from Peckham Way Station. Obviously, I won't have the Elizabethan and Tudor and Stuart books in there, but I'm going to have some sort of facsimile of those things, and try and make as parallel an exhibition as possible for people to come and visit.
Brilliant. Well, I hope I can come and visit. That's something I'm planning to do when it opens as well. I think it's a bit surreal to think we've done most of this, and we only really met, I think, once maybe at the very start, although very fittingly at the Middle Temple. So yeah. So thank you so much again to you, Loraine, for coming today. I know we're going to continue our conversation in a few months' time for London Craft Week about this as well, which we're very excited to be kind of hurled into the craft world to do this. So just thank you again so much, and I look forward to seeing these pieces when they're finished.
Thank you both so much for your input. It's just been an absolutely illuminating process, and I've really loved working with you.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you both.